And to me, whether or not you are a diasporic identity, our bodies are evidence of us being walking collages. We're collages of multiple experiences. So what I want my body as geography to do, how I want people to engage with it, is to spark conversation about our bodies, about listening to our bodies, about taking care of our bodies, of each other's bodies, right? Like, what is consent? What is respect? How do we look out for each other? How do we make ourselves at home in ourselves? How do we feel safe inside of ourselves? And collectively, what's the conversation that we have to ensure that that happens, to ensure that everyone feels safe? Dawn, I'm kind of overwhelmed that you said that, because I feel like that's really what my life mission is to make work that is pointing people towards themselves and also towards each other for healing, um, for hope and encouragement.
So the Staten Islander News Organization is here this morning with Sifiso Mabena. She's a New York-based Zimbabwean multidisciplinary theater maker, and this is from her profile, who is a skilled actor, singer, puppeteer, playwright, and deviser. Her work often explores displacement and the diasporic communities, history, identity, and femininity. As a playwright, Sifiso has collaborated with the Royal Court Theatre and the British Council. Her work has been performed at the Harare International Festival of the Arts winner. It's pronounced Taifa Direct.
Hyper direct, yes.
Taifa Direct 2011. Intuasa Festival and Chimani Mani Festival.
Yeah.
More recently, Sifiso co-directed the Othello project for Shake on the Lake and premiered her show, Sunflower, at Dixon Place in June 2022. Okay. So just briefly, this wasn't really on, but Shake on the Lake, that's Shakespeare on the Lake in Central Park?
No, this is Shakespeare on the Lake in Perry, New York.
I
It's
see.
state, yeah.
So it's not the reservoir. Okay, just to be clear. Okay. My Body is Geography is a novel form of expression combining various elements. How does the body store memories and trauma? What audience responses in terms of personal, long-time emotional, intellectual, and intuitive growth would you wish to provoke, Sifiso?
So,
Sifiso.
yes. Yeah, I think so. Something that I think has been marking my work recently has been this idea of collage, the theatrical pastiche, maybe. And so you just read my bio and you read that I'm a multidisciplinary artist. And so I enjoy moving in and out of different modes of storytelling and mixing them live on stage. And that's what I'm calling a theatrical pastiche. So My Body is Geography is like a mishmash of different artistic disciplines and forms, right? And I think where that comes from for me is when I think about our bodies and I think about the stories that we carry and the things that are like written on us, there's this book, My Body Keeps the Score, that posits that our bodies can be read as a score sheet of our emotions and stories, right? And so I'm using that as a framework. So when I think about that and I think about my own body, I think about the plurality of experiences, some good, some bad, that I carry, that my body naturally holds. It might be in my posture, it might be in my voice, it might be in how I respond in certain environments, right? And then add to that the fact that I'm an immigrant here. And the fact, and anyone with a diaspora identity understands this feeling of hybridity, of being from one place and being in another place, of travel, of it. And to me, whether or not you are a diasporic identity, our bodies are evidence of us being walking collages. We're collages of multiple experiences. So, what I want my body as geography to do, how I want people to engage with it, is to spark conversation about our bodies, about listening to our bodies, about taking care of our bodies, of each other's bodies, right? Like, what is consent? What is respect? How do we look out for each other? How do we make ourselves at home in ourselves? How do we feel safe inside of ourselves? And collectively, what's the conversation that we have to ensure that that happens, to ensure that everyone feels safe?
That seems like a really fundamentally important thing that is often overlooked. And the fact that you're articulating this here, I think is really be like a prize to any viewer or reader. It's incredible. So in your own journey, how did you find that you like to create in this manner, switching, as it were, from one modality of expression to the next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the spark of it was from South Africa. I went to school to undergrad at Rhodes University, and there's something about South African theater that is multidisciplinary in nature. A show that I always come back to as like a guiding light almost. A patron saint of shows for me is Ubu and the Truth Commission, which was a collaboration with Handspring Puppets, and William Kentridge, a South African artist, worked on that, and Jane Taylor directed it. And I mean, it was incredible. It was a play that was about the truth and reconciliation trials in South Africa. But they were like moments of puppetry. There was acting, there was dance, there was song. And I think a lot of South African theater is like that. And because that's where I trained, I think I've carried that a little bit. And then I went to grad school at Sarah Lawrence, and I did an MFA in theater that was multidisciplinary. Um, and so I think that that's one element of it. And then in terms of this particular expression that I've started moving in, this like theatrical pastiche, I think that that came out during the pandemic. I was really drawn to Afro surrealism, and the idea, like if you look at collage, if you look at a lot of Afro surreal work, there is this sort of collage aesthetic. And I started playing around with stop motion and puppetry of things that are fitted together. So yeah, I think that's where that comes from for me.
Thank you, Sifiso. That's interesting. So it's actually really using your artistic expression to heal, in a sense. It seems like you're bringing awareness, and through this healing, just the aware in and of itself, the awareness of, well, I mean, most people think, oh, I have some tension in my shoulders, I've had a difficult week, but it extends beyond that.
Yeah, Don, I'm kind of overwhelmed that you said that, because I feel like that's really what my life mission is to make work that is pointing people towards themselves and also towards each other for healing, um for hope and encouragement.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's incredible. Thank you so much. Why is it important to teach audiences to address this reality, and how is this especially relevant to women in diaspora?
Yeah, I think I know I'll speak from the I and say that I don't think this is a very new conversation even for me. this is something that I'm stumbling upon in my own journey, right? And I think about how I have, like, I feel privileged, right? I feel privileged that I have access to the kind of materials that, that would allow me to have these to think about these things and to have these conversations with people. But then I think about someone like my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who was a strong woman. Like in my body is geography, I talk about her and I say that um, she was a strong woman with a heavy-handed message, right? Which is my nice way of saying that she could do a bit of this if it was necessary. But I think about someone like my grandmother who was brilliant. She was incredible, but she grew up in Rhodesia, what was then Rhodesia. Zimbabwe is now independent and has changed name. But I think about someone who grew up in that context, in a colonial, like a country that was being colonized. I'll say that way. She was a Black woman, and I think about how that held her back in life and the rage that she carried inside of herself because of it, right? I think about how if she had been born today, how far, like, I think about how she would have gone so far. This was a woman who was industrious, who was a genius with her hands. She could make anything, literally anything. She didn't even need a pattern to make clothes or to crochet or to knit. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking about it in terms of my own healing, but I'm thinking about people like my grandmother, and I'm thinking that even though even though Rhodesia is a thing of the past, people who live in that reality still exist. And how I want my body as geography to be a traveling show. I want it to be a show that like goes into communities and engages with people. One of the things I discovered at Snug Harbor that was like fascinating and amazing was this idea of audience participation before the show, during the show, and after. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's important to talk about these things because I think not everyone has voice to talk about it, and not everyone has opportunity or space to talk about it. And so I want this show to be an opportunity to create space.
That's interesting too. And what you say that, you're privileged that in this time you have access to these materials and all this, and you're taking that privilege and sharing it with as many people as you can to uplift them. So that is not something that necessarily had to be either. So you're taking what you have and not squandering it selfishly. I'm sure that there are ways as an artist one can do that. It seems like your whole orientation is toward bringing awareness and, like I said, healing. So that's incredible. Um, Hailing from Zimbabwe, Sifiso, how do you see social class issues different here in the States from your country of origin due to our differing histories? How does your perspective lend you insight into our own society that might be otherwise overlooked or missed? Just because we're all like right here, and perspective is good.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's such starkly different contexts, right? You have America, which is this global superpower, and Zimbabwe, which is an incredibly it's a brilliant nation. It's like got so much potential, but it is categorized as a developing nation, and we have a lot of problems. Every country has a lot of problems, right? But right now Zimbabwe is in an economic crisis, um, and we're plagued by corruption. And honestly, I think the instability of the economy is really sort of like holding back any real progress that we can make. And I won't go into like the details of that, but I'll say that when I was growing up in Zimbabwe, a middle class existed, And the current situation is such that there is now the haves and the have-nots. There is no one in the middle. You are either rich, extremely wealthy. And when I say extreme wealth, I'm talking about seeing sports cars and like brand new vehicles that I don't even see on the road in New York, which is like a big city rolling around in Zimbabwe, right? And then you have extreme poverty, right? Like, and those things just sort of coexist. That's the reality right now over there. However, there are things that I recognize that I have empathy for in America that I see. And the thing is, the way wealth works here in America, it to me it appears that it changes from state to state, right? I have so many friends that are always complaining, especially people who are New York transplants that come from like the Midwest or like the DMV. Someone just yesterday was like, in Baltimore, I could rent a house with 2 bedrooms and a backyard for $800. And in New York, that gets me a room.
Yes.
It's like, money changes behavior from state to state, and like states have different, well, like the wealth is different. It's different. But I will say that there are some things I see in common, at least where oppression is concerned. Like I can understand what a water crisis feels like. That's something that is at home and that I see here. I understand what like like a housing crisis, unemployment. And the thing that I am just going to say and leave to hang in the air is that the one thing that looks like it's in common is that people of color are disproportionately affected by these issues. And that just feels like a global issue rather than just something that's happening in America.
Thank you so much. And this question should have been prior to that one. Seems like I jumped around a little bit. How and why is feminism relevant when considering how the body stores and holds experiences?
Yeah, well, I identify as a woman and I'm a Black woman, and I think that that in itself is just a political thing. We live in a society that is uh, predominantly patriarchal, right? And there's sites of resistance and ways that we're resisting that. Can you help me? Can you reroute me again? Refocus me with that question, Don.
Okay, so we discussed how the body stores and hold experiences. And
That's right. That's right.
interestingly, you spoke about it in terms of us being as a sort of mosaic of good and bad, where a lot of times if people address this, it's almost like they have to rid themselves of the bad. So I found that interesting also. Like that's a different perspective that, it is the tensions we hold. That's part of how we express ourselves. That's part of our voice. It goes into it all, into the big picture. Over time, that can shift and change. So
Yes.
when it comes to women,
Yes.
specifically, and the concept of feminism, which broadly to say is the upliftment of women, um, in broadest terms, how is that related to the concept of bodies storing, I guess, trauma? Storing good as well, but I mean, focusing on trauma because trauma is what everyone's trying to get past in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I think that in the context of um, a patriarchal society, that's going to happen, right? It's like a structure of oppression. Something that came up the first time that we read the scene that I shared from My Body is Geography aloud as a group within the cohort was that and we're talking about feminism right now because I've started this show with my story. I've sparked the conversation by sharing my story. And my hope is that the piece will grow to include other voices and other stories. But I think that right now, what was interesting about people's responses to what I shared is they were able to pinpoint different modalities of oppression that I identified as having affected who this person is, right? And so it became a conversation about something like, I'm a person of faith, and I'm very spiritual, but I also have to be honest about the fact that the institution, the religious institution, has at times oppressed me. I mean, their oppression is a conversation where religion is concerned in many, like in many ways, but that's a part of that's a part of my trauma, right? Is there is like religious trauma that has happened. I think about safety, just even like if we're talking about the upliftment of women, and we're talking about the just difference in how women have to move through the world, you know, that um yeah, that there's harassment on the streets sometimes, that, you know, there's like things that are just absorbed, that I think a lot of women just tend to get on with, you know, like if my mom is the kind of person that will say, like, if you stop and cry about everything, you'll never get to where you're going, you know. And I think that's like I don't know that that's the healthiest mindset to have. I think there's a middle ground.
Yeah.
um But yeah, I don't know. I think that when I'm thinking about trauma and how we hold it, I think it's I I don't necessarily think about the trauma itself. I think about the things that are causing it, and how what's the intervention to that. How, when, you know, the one of the central questions of this piece is, how do we feel safe? How do we make ourselves at home?
Yes, and to conclude, that's what I feel a big part of this is just feeling, experiencing feeling, and feeling comfort as well. Not just feeling because you could feel and then feel all, you know, jagged inside or whatever. Feeling comfort. I feel as though you're on a quest to bring a certain kind of spiritual comfort to people from themselves, kind of like giving them the tools to explore it. And not some drawn out course over time where people just in this, you know, intimate moment of creativity, you're giving them this experience. It's a spark that, as you said, you know, can provoke in them. This is incredible.
Thank you, John.
You're quite welcome. Okay, so moving on to the puppets. Who are some of your own favorite puppets, and what is it about each of those puppets that you love?
So I've already mentioned the Ubu and the Truth Commission. Like, I absolutely love the puppets from that. I just love handspring puppet stuff. They're the people that did Warhorse, um, and what's another? They've done so much. I don't know. Check them out. But I think a better way for me to engage with that question is to just talk about the puppetry community in New York, and say, because I could mention so many puppeteers only because I'm part of the community. And I mean, just on Friday night, I was watching puppetry. And I'm constantly engaging with places like Here Arts, La Mama, Dixon Place, uh, the Carriage House, which is like from Henson. The Henson Foundation does a lot of work to like showcase puppet work. Um, but I don't know, I'm interested. I have a friend called Leah Ogawa who uses different materials to make, I don't know, she makes these experiences. It's like object movement, but there's something ethereal and dance-like about it. She has this piece with these legs that sort of just run on their own. It's just gorgeous and heartbreaking. And she tells a whole story with nothing but these legs that are suspended in air, and she sort of controls them off the side with these strings. And so you're just watching these legs tell a story. It's absolutely gorgeous. I have another friend, Maria Kamiya, who's built a world called Arikama. Check her out. She also makes her own clothes that she sells. She's got like a fashion line. She's pretty hardcore. But Maria's work resonates with me because all of her puppets are about healing and life and practicing play. And so I think we're aligned in that sense. Yeah, those are some of my favorite puppeteers and stuff that they're working on. But those, yeah, I want to direct you to those places because they're showcasing some really, really cool artists.
Okay, thank you so much. When you're reflecting on your creative contributions to our world, what are some of your accomplishments that make you really smile? What creative works have audiences and actors given you the most positive feedback on? So that's kind of like a question of what to you personally and what to others.
Um, the thing that makes me smile is the last show that I made called Sunflower. And it's interesting, I didn't realize this, but in preparing for this, it sort of became clear where last year I did the show Sunflower, which was really about making oneself at home in another country. It was about my journey as an immigrant, and also to a certain extent about my family or families in as like a national family, if I'm thinking about a country being a sort of national family and then the sort of smaller family unit, right? And so I juxtaposed those two things, and I found out during the pandemic, well, yeah, is it officially over yet?
Um, I think it's officially over, but there are still people who are falling ill to COVID. So,
Great. So when the pandemic started, I will say, um, we lost the last of our elders. And so my dad's generation is now the oldest generation of our family. And my mom shared at that time that Mabena is actually, it's like a moniker that my grandfathers chose themselves and wasn't our original family name. And for some reason, that was really, I don't know, it was surprising to me, and I think that it challenged my own sense of myself because I had always thought that I was one tribe. I grew up fully believing I was Ndebele, which is like a Nguni tribe, and found out I was Shona, and I I was like, there's like dynamics within Zimbabwe that made that a very shocking thing for me. So Sunflower was like a way for me to process that artistically. And so it was very special to me. And I collaborated with my friends Marcella, Renee Murray, and Juliet Holiday. It felt like such a safe and beautiful way to dig into these things and to talk about home. And I use the metaphor of a plant and transplanting it and putting down roots, making roots, uprooting, that became a really important thing. And then now the show I'm working on is about making oneself at home in one's own body. And I feel like they're in conversation with each other. And that was quite fun to consider. But in terms of the work that people talk to me about or referred to a lot the first play I ever wrote was called The Comeback, and it was an opportunity I got through the British Council in Zimbabwe. I got mentorship from this really amazing British playwright called Rebecca Pritchard, who was she was on the vanguard of something called the In Your Face theatre movement in England. Train Spotting is another play that came out of that movement, just to give some context. And she wrote a play called Yard Girls. Yeah, Yard Girls, about Essex. I think that's what it's called. So yeah, I wrote this play, and it was about, I had just moved back from the UK. I'd moved back to Southern Africa. And I think that I didn't know what to do. I felt that there's in Zimbabwe, they call people who live abroad diasporas. And I say that only because Zimbabwe's got a very unique situation where there's a significant, like I'm talking 2 million maybe out of a population of like 12 to 60. I don't know. I'm going to fact check myself about what the population of Zimbabwe is. I'm going to guess 12. Let's see how far off I am. Oh, I'm so off. 15. I was closer when I said 16. So 16 million people in Zimbabwe, and there's at least 2 million who live outside of the country. And that's partly because it's difficult, it's untenable to live in Zim comfortably. And there's political, some people are sort of political refugees. It's like several reasons as to why people have had to move. But there's essentially a large number of Zimbabweans living all over the world, like in England, Norway, America, like everywhere. South Africa, huge population in South Africa. And so I wrote The Comeback as someone who was dealing with this phenomenon where in Zimbabwe, people have this image of what it's like to live in America. Like there's people who from home will call me and ask me about my life here in New York. And I think they imagine that I'm like skating on streets of gold, that like it's just that my life is like like what it's like on the movies, that it's like an episode of Sex and the City or something. And like that's not my reality, like I'm here hustling, on the subway, like I'm short, so like you're standing under someone's armpit, you're like dodging rats.
Your real experience that like people would never even think of. Yeah.
People wouldn't think of that, and so I joke about it, but I think that it was the first time that I'd been abroad and had come home, and I felt this like this dissonance of like people looking at me like, first of all, why are you back here? Like, you must have failed if you couldn't survive over there. And then also like there was like this expectation that I wasn't meeting, and I was different and home was different. And so I wrote something called The Comeback about that, and it later went on to tour. And the lady that took the role of Ellie ended up winning a National Arts Merit Award for her role as Ellie in The Comeback. And I think it's because it was speaking to this experience that it was like, this was in 2011, and I think people were starting to articulate this thing, the diasporas. And so, yeah, people talk to me a lot about that play.
Thank you so much. And this isn't exactly as I had it, but what would you consider mastery of this craft that you engage in? To you, what is your highest goal?
Wow. That's a really good question. I think that for me, my personal goal in making the way that I make is a facility. If I'm thinking about collage or like working with different elements, right? I could maybe think of them as different semiotics that come together to make meaning, right? I'm making meaning out of something. And I think to me, mastery will happen. I will have achieved mastery of this particular form of communication when there is like a cleanliness in the way that that allows engagement. I had a professor in undergrad that talked about textuality, and he said like really good literature or really good text is text that remains open. It leaves a gap for the person responding to the work to enter themselves. And I think right now, a lot of my work is very dense. It's like I'm like giving all of these ideas. And I think that my aim as an artist is to create work that is nuanced and like create that, and in flow has openings to engage with people in the moment. And I know that that's such an esoteric answer, but I think I think that's the closest that I can get.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
On a hard skills level, as a puppeteer, I want to be making my own puppets and yeah, just clear storytelling, clear storytelling.
Thank you, Sifiso. The Royal Court Theatre is in London, specifically the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, dating back to the 19th century. At the Royal Court Theatre, what were some of your collaborations?
Yeah, that was actually a really fun thing. I mentioned Rebecca Pritchard that I'd worked with at the British Council, and Rebecca introduced me to Elise Dodgson, who sadly passed away a few years ago. But Elise was incredible. She was a New Yorker who she made herself a home in London, and basically her work at the Royal Court Theatre was to travel. It's beautiful. She would like travel around the world and engage with playwrights and support playwrights. And she collaborated with the British Council in Zimbabwe, who, as I mentioned before, produced The Comeback. And I got invited along with 10 other playwrights on 3 residencies that were just amazing, where Elise Dodgson, Winsome Pinnock, who's another playwright, a Black British playwright in England. She's also a professor. And Leo Butler, like we worked on creating new plays with them over the course, I would say, of about 2 years. And it wasn't that we went there, they sent representatives from the Royal Court Theatre and like treated us to this amazing residency where we did a lot of skills sharing. We had training and we developed work that was like they put up in readings and things. It was really exciting.
Well, thank you so much. And Sophia, so how do you use the puppets to teach about intergenerational trauma?
Well, I'll reference Sunflower and say that at least in that, how puppetry operated was that it kind of, if I was using the metaphor of a country to represent a family, the puppets were icons and symbols of nationhood, like the Zimbabwe bird in different iterations. There was like a flower puppet too, which was the colors of the Zimbabwe flag. So I think that ended up being the way in which I addressed any kind of sort of history or relationship between history. And like I say, I was dealing with my own family. I don't know. I don't want to say drama. It wasn't drama. I think it was dramatic for me. No one else was stressed about the fact that we're not Ndebele. But I was really bowled over by it. But yeah, I think that that's like one instance that I can speak to where but I think that it was a metaphor as opposed to being something that was like a direct response or address that directly.
Thank you. Excuse me. And the next question I wrote before actually speaking with you, but I feel even more strongly. This was just based on what I was reading, but I definitely feel even, as I said, more strongly that this is the case. Your work could be described as life-changing for some audience members. As an artist, what motivates you personally? They're two not so related. The first statement and the second question don't relate that well, but sorry.
Yeah, I think you really said it. I felt so seen by that. My life mission is to make work that allows people to reflect on themselves more deeply, to reflect on our world and the people around us more deeply. Um, and yeah, I keep using this phrase to turn inward because I think that we are divine, we are beautiful, and there is a lot of bad stuff that happens, right? But I think that some of that is because we don't see ourselves for who we are. You know, like when you talk about things like racism and xenophobia, phobia, these are fear-based things, and these are things that don't allow you to see people's humanity. Um, and I'm like, if we saw ourselves first and we accepted ourselves unconditionally, you know, I think that would help us to engage with other people and maybe not agree all the time, but to see people's humanity. You know, I'm from Southern Africa and we live by something called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu just basically means I am because we are. I cannot exist without you, Don. And your success is my success.
That's really important. I think that, like I said, these are fundamentally important. It's not just concepts. These are I guess life ways. You're getting a person to look at themselves is the basis of all change, I feel. So, we all are, when you said self-acceptance, I guess part of it is self-acceptance of our traumas, because I find that's part of it too, is all of us, or maybe some of us, find it almost like difficult that, well, how have I not gotten past this or that so quickly? How am I still dealing with this?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I get so frustrated with myself sometimes. I'm like, stop doing this. And I'm learning how to be patient with myself, how to have grace with myself. But you know, you're right. It's a challenge. It's a lifelong work. It's a decision that is moment to moment to yeah, to act yeah, you're so right. You're so right.
Okay. Snug Harbor sits in Livingston on Staten Island's more cosmopolitan and certainly diverse North Shore. Many kids in this area, especially Port Richmond, but it's not limited to Port Richmond really, have moved here from Mexico and other Latin American countries. Your work addresses their real life experience, or at least it's analogous to their real life experience. How might such kids connect more deeply with your puppet show than possibly other audience members? Or I will say what you're talking about, this is fundamental to any person, but still, okay.
Yeah, well, I yeah, I think like right at the top we were talking about hybridity and like people who are transplants who've moved, and I'm someone who's an immigrant. I've been an immigrant since I normally tell people 14, but then my mom reminded me that soon after I was born, we in Zimbabwe, we moved to England for 3 years. So, you know, you could say since I was born, I've had that like label of immigrant, or that identity rather of immigrant. Um, and yeah, so I think that anyone who has that experience, who engages with my work, will resonate with that. They'll like relate to that because it's part of how I see the world, and so it's always going to be in my work, I think.
Sifiso, thank you so much. That concludes this interview. I feel this will be edifying for the audiences. I felt so personally, like I really appreciate that you gave of yourself, in this way creatively, because it's, creativity encompasses a lot, all the way from like, commercial creativity, which is cool in some ways. Like I love commercial art. There's cool things about it too. On the other end, something that's so not that commercial art can't be deeply personal, but what you're doing is geared toward something deeply personal, other than, in contrast to selling a product. You're trying to help people in the most important ways to live in themselves and live in their circumstances, and it seems to be to do so with some sense of ease and contentment.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, Don, I feel very encouraged by you,
I
honestly.
feel encouraged by you as well. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Me too. Me too. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. It was great meeting you, and I hope you have a great time continuing with your creative endeavors.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you. Thanks so much for this
Thank you. Stay well.
too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Bye.